take a look at the questions from the Major's Cabin and Aristotle chapter real quick. All right, so first, how does Sophie characterize her own compulsion to approach and enter the Major's cabin? So this starts on page 95, so let's go there. Major's cabin, second page of the Major's cabin. And we can see that. So she, Sophie, was quite startled at her own boldness. How did she dare do this? She had no idea. It was as if something impelled her. And then it goes on about how she went into the house and so forth. Now, these couple of lines here are so important. I want you to bear these in mind as we move forward in Sophie's story. I'm going to read it one more time. She was startled at her own boldness. We all have experienced that before. You maybe do something you just wouldn't even think to do in other circumstances, but for whatever reason, you do it today. That's normal. How did she dare do this? Common thought to ourselves when this happens. She had no idea. So this is something completely new to her. Fair enough. Again, maybe this is something we are acting out of character is what we often say. But this in particular, among those ideas, it was as if something impelled her. It was as if something impelled her. What is this something? Why is it in quotation marks? Is this Sophie's description? It seems as such, but why would she put something in quotation marks? This is an interesting way of putting this, getting this across to us. It was as if something impelled her. Why not just something without the quotation marks? I don't have an answer for you today, but keep this in mind. This is what her thought is. It was as if something impelled her. What is the something is an important question here. We could say, oh, well, you can chalk it up to it being her sense of courage. But then this is out of character for her. Why is she all of a sudden being so bold and rash almost even to do this thing? Right? Is it something of her own design? Is it something compelling her from the outside or impelling her from the outside? These are the questions you should be entertaining right now. So this is her reaction to it, but there's more beneath the surface. What is inscribed on each of the two paintings she discovers in the cabin? This we can see also starting on page 95 at the bottom. On one of the walls hung two pictures. One was an oil painting of a white house which lay a stone's throw from the little bay with a red boathouse. Between the house and the boathouse was a sloping garden with an apple tree, a few thick bushes, and some rocks. A dense fringe of birch trees framed the garden like a garland. The title of the painting was Berkeley, and I'm only assuming that I have pronounced that correctly. Beside that painting hung an old portrait of a man sitting in a chair by a window. He had a book in his lap. This picture also had a little bay with trees and rocks in the background. It looked as though it had been painted several hundred years ago. The title of the picture was Berkeley. The painter's name was Schmiebert. And then it says, Berkeley and Bjerkeli, how strange. Now, those of you who've studied philosophy before should instantly have jumped on the way that I pronounced that name. His name is actually Berkeley. Now, why did I pronounce it Berkeley? Because I really want us to pay attention to the way this text is written. The two names specifically. How strange. What's strange? Well, it's not strange to have two paintings. It's not even strange to have two paintings in your house with an inscription on them. It's strange that these two names, Berkeley, which I'm pronouncing Berkeley for a moment, and Bjerkeli, have so much in common. In fact, the only thing separating them in spelling is a J and an E towards the end. So there's something going on there. Again, we're going to simply bookmark this, put a pin in it, but keep this in mind. Now, this painting of Berkeley is a famous painting, and you should really look it up. Just look up Berkeley and Schmiebert, and I actually don't know how to pronounce it. I assume it's Schmiebert that you'll want to look up. But you'll see the painting that's being talked about here. What strange thing happens while she's in the cabin, and how does it reflect her philosophical journey so far? 96 again, towards the bottom, about 2/3 of the way down. She's in the living room, right? It says, Sophie began to make faces at herself in this mirror that she's looking at, like she did at home in the bathroom. So this mirror that's in the Major's cabin, she's making faces at it. Common thing to do, maybe. Her reflection did exactly the same, which was only to be expected, but all of a sudden something scary happened. Just once in the space of a split second, Sophie saw quite clearly that the girl in the mirror winked with both eyes. Sophie started back in fright. If she herself had winked, how could she have seen the other girl wink? This is a little confusing to us because in English as we commonly use it, to wink is by definition to blink with one eye. So we need to translate this a little bit for ourselves. This means that she blinked, right? Meaning she winked both eyes, writing that she winked with both eyes means she blinked. So think about that. If you blink, you cannot see yourself blink. You can maybe see yourself start to blink, maybe you finish blink. You do not ever see yourself actually blink. You can see yourself wink, of course, if you have one eye open still, but if you blink, you can't see yourself. That's what's going on here. Not only that, it seemed as though the other girl had winked at Sophie as if to say, I can see you, Sophie. I am in here on the other side. Distressing, right? Let's be honest. This is pretty freaky stuff. I mean, again, we can say the video that the philosopher made was pretty intense, pretty weird, but possibly studio made. How do you make something like this? How can this mirror be, is it some sort of an illusion? I mean, how would it be possible? Even like a so-called magic mirror or a house of mirrors, there are all sorts of mirrors out there, but no one of them can somehow delay time in a way that you see yourself blink. Is it a recording of her? Is she being recorded, but then somehow there's a lag? But it doesn't say Sophie blinked first. It simply said that the mirror itself blinked at her. Not that Sophie blinked and then she saw the mirror blink, but that the mirror itself blinked. So not even a recording explains this. So we push technology aside at this point and say something else very strange is going on here. And we should start to be a little bit on the edge of our seats. We should start to think a little outside the box what could be happening right now. Let's move on to Aristotle. So what does Aristotle believe is our most important tool for inquiry into the world? Now, I have to admit, this question is framed in a way that maybe you're looking for the one specific tool that Aristotle talks about. It's not really going to be there. There's a little bit of misleading going on here. But what we could say definitely makes him stand out against Plato is this theme of rationalism versus empiricism, or put another way, this distrust of the senses on the part of Plato and this greater trust in the senses and observation on the part of Aristotle. So if we look on page 105, it says, to exaggerate even more than he has so far, we could say that Plato turned his back on the sensory world and shut his eyes to everything we see around us. He wanted to escape from the cave and look out over the eternal world of ideas. Aristotle did the opposite. He got down on all fours and studied frogs and fish, anemones and poppies. While Plato used his reason, Aristotle used his senses as well. This too could be potentially misleading, even as Gaarder himself says a little bit, a couple of pages later. This doesn't mean that Aristotle is against reason. In fact, look on page 108 in the middle, and it says, Aristotle did not deny that humans have innate reason. On the contrary, it is precisely reason, according to Aristotle, that is man's most distinguishing characteristic. But our reason is completely empty until we have sensed something. That's the important aspect to get across here. The ideas of horses are not there because of a recollection. The version that Plato and even Socrates seems to be talking about, we're recalling the original form of horses or form of mathematics, and that's how we recognize it in the world. No, Aristotle is saying we see horses. We see a bunch of horses, and that leaves an impression of our minds, certain characteristics, certain form of horse starts to be impressed in our minds. This is what we get the sense of, and so when we see a new one, it's not that different from the others, even if it were missing a leg or something terrible, we would recognize, oh, this is a horse too, or this must be a horse too. So he's simply saying reason is an extremely important feature too. It's an important tool. It's just, though, not capable of doing things on its own without having first retrieved a lot of sensory information. We have to get a lot of ideas from the world, as it were, not big ideas, but ideas in our minds. We get those impressions from the world. These ideas give us a sense of what form is. And if we recall from the in-depth look, that's not to be separated from the things we see themselves. That is the material in which the form is sort of, I almost said incarcerated, but embodied, right? So form and material are really just separable ideas for us in our minds. And reason, therefore, is useful, but we shouldn't mistake it for the thing that we're actually observing or experiencing. How does Sophie choose to spend her time immediately after finishing Aristotle? So on 117 to 118 is where she just kind of goes in on this cleaning frenzy. Sophie had an irresistible desire to clean up after she kind of looked around and saw the mess around her. The first thing she did was to pull all the clothes out of the closet onto the floor, and it was necessary to start all over, and then it goes through what she starts doing to clean up her room. One thing she did have trouble with, this is just a little side note here, a tangent, but an important one, again, with the weird things that have been happening so far. One thing she did have trouble with, a white knee-length stocking. The problem was that the other one of the pair was missing. What's more, it had never been Sophie's. She examined it carefully. There was nothing to identify the owner, but Sophie had a strong suspicion about who the owner was. She throws it up on the shelf with all the other things that belong to this weirdness category, as it were, in her mind. So, more stuff on Hilda, but the important thing here is that she wants to change the way in which she doesn't just live in the world in her room, but also thinks in the world. On page 118, for instance, from now on, things would be kept neat, and she didn't only mean in her room. After reading Aristotle, she realized it was just as important to keep her ideas orderly. All right, so why do you suppose Alberto decides that he must move after Sophie has discovered the cabin where he was living? Why all this secrecy? Now, I can't answer this question for you because that would spoil things, but I am going to try and help think through this a little bit. I really want you to be teasing it out yourself, but every now and then I'm just going to drop a little bit of guidance along the way. So let's take a look at page 105. Actually, the bottom of 104 to 105. He says, no, I'm not angry. If you were just as curious when it comes to discovering, this is, of course, Alberto speaking, when it comes to discovering answers to the riddles of philosophy, I'd say your adventure was very promising. It's just a little annoying that I'll have to move now. Still, I have no one to blame but myself, I suppose. I might have known you were a person who would always want to get to the bottom of things. I want to, of course, this is quoting where this thought is, like where she becomes aware that Alberto has to move, and we should be thinking about this too. But I want to go and peruse this one more time. There are clues in here. No, I'm not angry. Well, so this is an interesting statement to me. No, I'm not angry. What makes him so sure that Sophie is worried about him being angry? If you go back to the last chapter, she seems very regretful of what she did. She is concerned that the philosopher will never want to write to her again or speak to her again, etc., etc. But she writes the letter that the philosopher hasn't read yet at the end of that chapter. In other words, that we know what she wrote, but he shouldn't know what she wrote. You know, she's apologizing for what happened and everything, but he doesn't know that yet, right? How could he possibly know that if he hasn't received her letter yet? She's still waiting for Hermes to show up with his letter to do the trade-off, the exchange, and then he's going to get her letter later on. So something chronologically almost doesn't make sense here. Either he's very presumptive in assuming that Sophie must feel terrible about this, and would feel terrible that thinking that he must be angry about this, or something else is going on. That's all I'm going to say about that at the moment, but keep entertaining that something else is going on thing. If you are just as curious when it comes to discovering answers to the riddles of philosophy, I'd say your adventure was very promising. Okay, so this is tying something really important for us. We can already see there's something about, at least for Alberto, some connection between her curiosity around philosophy and her curiosity around, well, his story and what is slowly becoming her story, what's going on around their relationship right now. So this adventure was very promising. I'd say your adventure was very promising. Why isn't he saying, in other words, if you are just as curious when it comes to discovering answers to the riddles of philosophy, I'd say your adventure will be very promising. She's not done with philosophy yet. He must not be talking about philosophy by itself, per se. I'd say your adventure was very promising. It was a good thing, maybe, or it was very promising for you to have invaded my space and taken the envelope and all that other stuff. Is that what he's saying? Or maybe it was very promising that you saw the two paintings, or maybe witnessed something crazy happening with the mirror. Something, again, weird is going on here. Be really mindful of these moments. You kind of feel them creep up, and it's very easy to just pass it over and go, that was a weird way to say that, and pass it over and not think twice about it. Think twice about it. These are weird statements being made. It was very promising means nothing necessarily directly about the philosophical adventure she's on. This seems to be about the adventure she went on in trying to understand who Alberto is. And then this last part, I have no one to blame but myself, I suppose. Why? Why is he blaming himself for this? So he has to move. He says, I might have known you were a person who would always want to get to the bottom of things. Well, maybe he knew that. It's kind of weird when you think about it. How does he know who she is to begin with? Obviously, he's a stalker? No, something's going on for sure. But then I have no one to blame but myself. So did he know she was going to do something like that? And he just kind of chose to procrastinate on doing something about it? Why is he blaming himself for this? Also very odd. Okay, last couple of questions. We only had 2 chapters here, so we're just doing another question or 2 for Aristotle. Aristotle clearly holds the wrong opinion about women as unfinished men. Should we throw out or ignore all thoughts of someone who is so wrong about something like this? This seems like a really pertinent question. You could tell this is not a question that Gaarder would have necessarily asked in this moment. If we go to the page where this was mentioned, 116... I'm not going to hash it all out, but let's just let's tease out some specific points here. In Aristotelian language, the man provides the form and the woman contributes the substance. Okay, so he's not just saying that's just the way it is. It sounds like he's trying to think about it from his own view of metaphysics and provide a biological explanation for why he thinks that way. It's not a good explanation, and if you read Aristotle, it's not a good explanation there either. It's pretty dumb, quite honestly. There doesn't seem to be a lot of backing for it. But on page 117, Gaarder continues, Aristotle's erroneous views of the sexes was doubly harmful because it was his rather than Plato's view that held sway over the Middle Ages, or throughout the Middle Ages, excuse me. The church thus inherited a view of women that is entirely without foundation in the Bible, and so forth. This is important at the time that Gaarder is writing this book. This is important to point out that this whole bit about philosophy being dominated by men and all that stuff is terribly bad, or at least it's a waste at the very, in the weakest form. In the strongest form, it's dominant and potentially completely erroneous. Fair enough. In our present times, though, this is 2020, this is 30 years after he wrote the book. This line of thinking where we should perhaps call into question how much philosophy is being dominated by men and so forth. This project's been underway already for decades. not just with Gaarder, but Gaarder is just one among many who has called it out before. And it's no doubt, beyond a need to check in for agreement, it's beyond a doubt true that women need to be included in the philosophical tombs and canon. That said, I think it's really important to notice two things. One, many of them have. Going back, we'll talk later about some more modern thinkers, but even during the Renaissance, and to some extent in lesser proportion during this time period we're in, the teacher of Socrates was a woman from the Isle of Lesbos. She was an important figure to Socrates in his understanding. This was related by Plato, who of course had a more favorable opinion of women. But I think it'd be too easy to simply dismiss, well, yes, Plato's favorable view of women is the only reason we know about that. But the problem is still truly there. There's no doubt that there is a rather huge imbalance of men to women. And certainly that filter, whatever that filter could or would be today, that says women of the past or women of the present, more importantly even, don't make good philosophers, is a completely unfounded belief and shouldn't even really be put on the table. However, there's the opposite problem now, 30 years after this book was written, where many people will very readily throw out the work of someone like Aristotle or a Heidegger or something like that for either having the opinion they did of women or the appeal to Nazism in the case of Heidegger. And so this question feels very important to ask, because we're going to continue to run into not just philosophers, but people throughout our lives who are incredibly intelligent and have very excellent ideas, but not necessarily all their beliefs or their behaviors are commendable. And we have to ask the question, should we then allow their ideas to have any sway in the general public or in the discipline to which they pertain? My answer is that we should always be ready to detach the argument from the arguer and recognize that a good argument can take place even for that is, a good argument can be made by an arguer who is by all other means despicable or even just makes a wrong move from time to time. This was a terrible thought by Aristotle. It is also the more moronic thought among the things he's possibly thought or said, and I say this as someone who really admires him. But that's important, to be able to recognize that a bad arguer can have a good argument, and likewise, a good arguer can have a bad argument. If we judge then by the criterion of good or bad argument, we're less likely to miss the good stuff that comes our way, to take innovation in whatever form it comes up, and therefore not throw out the baby with the bathwater, were we to just get rid of everything that was touched by somebody who had an opinion we find to be highly untrustworthy. Okay, and the last part, whose influence seems greatest to you in today's world, Plato's or Aristotle's? Now, personally, I think that they both have had a really firm hold. Aristotle's, I would say in the end, probably has won out in many ways, but more so in the sciences than anywhere else. And Plato's perhaps more in the realm of mathematics and, I hate to say it, but spiritual matters. Not because there's anything wrong with spiritual matters, but because in some ways it's had a negative influence and a positive influence there. And the negative influence has made words like metaphysics sound ultra wooey when it really should never have been. But for more on this, what I highly recommend doing is actually checking out another book at some point along the way called The Cave and the Light by Arthur Herman. This is an incredibly a dense history. Well, I shouldn't say incredibly dense. It's a fairly thorough history, though, by a Pulitzer Prize winning author. And he is a historian more than a philosopher. However, he was clearly trained to think about philosophy, mathematics, and so forth at a young age. Herman writes about this kind of back and forth throughout history of dominance between thought by Plato and thought by Aristotle, and that this almost sort of yin-yangness, or this dark and the light between the two, or whatever version of that you'd like to say, the abstract and the earthliness of these two, have really, in a way, shaped so much of philosophy up to this point. There's some disagreement I have with certain aspects of that argument, but I nonetheless think that, if only for historical purposes, an absolutely excellent read to follow your finishing of Sophie's World later on. That's it for now. See you next time.